Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
I've spent the last few years interviewing some of the most successful gamblers in the world. It's allowed me to explore my hunch that there's a special kind of intelligence for thinking about risk and uncertainty, something I call risk intelligence. If psychologists study gamblers at all, they usually focus on problem gamblers. Not all gamblers are fools. Some are experts, and I think they've a lot to teach us about how to make wise decisions. The very idea of an expert gambler seems odd to some. Surely, they say, gambling is just a matter of luck. Sure, roulette, slot machines are games of pure chance, but with blackjack, poker, and sports betting, there's plenty of room for expertise. And in those games, expert gamblers consistently outperform novices. And this expertise can make them very rich. And it's this ability to make money from gambling that sets the experts apart from other types of gambler. As I learned more about the world of the professional gambler, I discovered that it was composed of three distinct tribes. First, there are the poker players, the rock stars of the gambling world, who win fame and fortune on the tournament circuit. Then there are the blackjack players, private, more austere, somewhat dismissive of the kind of glitzy celebrity of the poker players. And finally, there are the sports bettors, who gamble on everything from horse racing and golf to football and college basketball. They can be further subdivided into two distinct groups, the intuitive types and the computerized bettors. I became particularly interested in the intuitive sports bettors. And my interest in this group was piqued by a fascinating study of horse race handicappers by two American psychologists, Stephen Sessi and Jeffrey Leica. In the early 1980s, Sessi and Leica visited Brandywine Raceway, a horse racing venue in Delaware, and they interviewed 30 avid racetrack patrons. For the next 4 years, as they studied and tested these men, and they were all men, they discovered that they fell into two quite distinct groups. 14 of them, the experts, were remarkably good at predicting the final odds that would be offered for the horses in each race, while the remaining 16 were not much better than the average punter. On the basis of extensive interviews with these men, Sessi and Leica concluded that the mental processes by which the experts arrived at their predictions could be modeled as a complex linear equation based on 7 numbers referring to the horse's previous races, such as the average speed at which the horse ran, the size of the track, the weather conditions, so on. Except that these men didn't know anything about linear regression or statistical modeling. They did it unconsciously, intuitively, without really knowing how they did it. They paid attention, took in various bits of information, and then, while they mulled it over in their heads, as if from nowhere, a number would pop into their minds. And that number was usually very close to the real probability that the horse would win the race. And it's that mental process, taking into account a variety of information and somehow arriving on the basis of that at a probability estimate that I call risk intelligence. By now, I hope you're wondering what your own risk intelligence test, what your own risk intelligence is like. Well, if you'd like to find out, I've created an online test that anyone can take to measure their risk intelligence. The test consists of 50 statements, some true and some false, And your task is to say how likely you think it is that each statement is true and express that as a percentage. So what you're doing here is using probabilities to express your degree of certainty or uncertainty. And this graph illustrates the relationship between these two. So if you're absolutely sure of something, you express that by indicating the 100% figure. If you're absolutely certain that the statement is false, you express that by saying there's a 0% chance the statement's true. If you've got absolutely no idea whether the statement is true or false, you express that maximum uncertainty by saying you think there's a 50% chance that the statement is true. You might as well flip a coin. You have no idea. But if you are fairly sure that the statement's true, but you're not completely sure, you're in this region here, what I call on the slopes of this valley, then you click on 60%, 70%, 80%, 90%, depending on how sure you are. And conversely, if you're fairly sure that the statement's false, you would indicate that by saying you think it has a 40%, a 30%, 20%, or 10% chance of being true. Now, the test is quite unusual because it's possible to score very highly, even if you don't know very much. And that's because what you're measuring here is not your knowledge, but your self-knowledge. So the test rewards you for gauging your own level of uncertainty accurately, rather than for knowing a bunch of facts. And I think that may be why some of my brightest students seem to find the test more difficult than some of their more average peers. The brightest students are often used to being rewarded for knowing facts, and they're often quite cocky. They tend to be overconfident, and this test punishes overconfidence, and it punishes underconfidence too. So when you've estimated the chance, that the likelihood that each of these 50 statements in the test is true, the website will calculate your risk intelligence quotient, or RQ. That's a number between 0 and 100. And just as IQ is a measure of your general intelligence, so RQ, or risk quotient, is a measure of your risk intelligence. So risk intelligence is the ability to estimate probabilities accurately. But how can that help us make better decisions? It's all very well if someone tells you that it's going to rain today, you can just simply take your umbrella. But what if they say there's a 70% chance that it will rain? There's no point in cultivating better risk intelligence if you don't know how to use probability estimates. The first way, and the simplest way, is simply to set a threshold. So, for example, I might decide that I'll only ask someone out on a date if there's more than a 65% chance that they'll say yes. Now, different people could choose to set the thresholds at different levels, depending on how desperate they are to go on a date, and depending on how much they dislike being rejected. The second way to make decisions is bet sizing. The details can get complicated, but the basic idea is simple. Make the size of your bet proportional to your degree of confidence. The more sure you are of something, the more you should bet on it. For example, you could make the number of shares you buy in a company proportional to how strongly you believe that the company will do well. But this will only work, of course, if your confidence, your level of confidence, is well calibrated. Overconfidence is going to be fatal here. So it's crucial to have good risk intelligence if you're going to use this method of decision making. Finally, we can make decisions on the basis of probabilities by involving a concept that lies at the very heart of decision theory, the concept of expected value. The basic rule in gambling is only to wager money on bets that have a positive expected value. Most casino games and all national lotteries have negative expected values, which is why a professional gambler would never bet on them. The expected value is an abstract concept. It doesn't refer to any actual win or loss. It's the average amount that you would win or lose if you placed the same bet an infinite number of times. But this ethereal figure takes on an almost physical reality for the expert gambler, looming even larger in his or her consciousness than the actual profit or loss that hypnotizes the rest of us. Expert gamblers see something different when they look at a roulette wheel or a poker table. And that was brought home to me one night when a highly successful gambler invited me to accompany him to a casino. This particular gambler had made all his money from betting on horses, and he normally shunned casinos. And he only ventured in on this occasion because he wanted to give me and the other friends that were with him the thrill of someone playing for high stakes. We followed him over to the roulette table, and my friend proceeded to show off by placing bets of $1,000 on black. However, as he told me later, over cocktails in the casino bar, it wasn't this figure that was at the forefront of his mind. Instead, he just treated each bet as a bit of fun that cost him $52.60. Although he wasn't a casino gambler, he was familiar enough with roulette to know that the expected value of a bet on black is minus 0.0526. And that meant that on average, each bet of $1,000 would leave him $52.60 worse off. The actual profit or loss after 50 bets could be anything from minus 50,000 to plus 50,000. And my friend would be aware of that figure too, of course. But the figure that mattered most for him was the expected value of minus $52.60 per bet. That's not a good value bet, of course, which is why in any other circumstance a professional gambler would never play roulette unless he could spot a biased wheel or cheat. In focusing on the expected value of a bet rather than on the maximum possible profit or loss, expert gamblers look beyond the moment and view each gamble in the context of a much longer time horizon. Even gamblers are mortal, of course, so in reality the number of bets one can make is always finite. In the long run, as Keynes famously observed, we're all dead. But fretting about one's mortality tends to make people reckless. Professional gamblers maintain their cool by acting as if they were immortal and taking the long view. Of course, luck can go against you. There's no such thing as an absolute guarantee. Make your peace with chance. Accept that you can never control her or cajole her. Acknowledge her whimsical nature. Recognize that she doesn't care about you and never will. But don't despair. As Damon Runyon once said, the race is not always to the swift, nor the battle to the strong. But that's the way to bet. Thank you.
So coming on to that subjective element then, what do we know about the sort of black box processes that are going on among those who have that expert intuition? You mentioned words like mulling, for example, or just some kind of unconscious process that seems to throw up the numbers or throw up the probabilities in the minds of those who seem to have a real aptitude for this.
I think 90% of this is below the level of awareness. I think what happens at a conscious level is that we learn what factors to pay attention to. So we learn, for example, that the weather matters and the size of the horse's teeth don't, for example. Maybe they do, I mean, I don't know. But then once we've acquired that information, the process of mulling it over and stirring it in and sort of that, I think, just happens below the level of consciousness, because what I think happens when we become experts in a domain is that our brains form models of the domain in question, and they do something like forming some statistical model, but it's way below. We can't introspect that and explain it. It's just there. We form a hunch a strength of a feeling. And then the conscious level comes in there. Can we measure the strength of our own hunch? And so I think there's a conscious bit at the beginning and a conscious output, and in the middle there's a big, it's an unconscious sandwich.
And there are some interesting unconscious sandwiches. Good way of putting it. There's an interesting thing you mentioned about the way that you perhaps, when it comes to the point in the book, you say about how, for example, J.P. McManus, the Irish millionaire who's gambled his way to a fantastic fortune, applies various conscious strategies, though, to sort of gauge the level of risk. So he works, when he's playing backgammon, for example, he mentioned that he consciously makes mistakes to gauge the level of skill of the opponent.
Absolutely. So what he's trying to do there is trying to gather information. So you can certainly, there is a lot, you can certainly improve your risk intelligence by, for example, gathering a wider amount of information on a subject and looking for information that might disprove your views, rather than just looking for information that would support your views. This is one of the problems that most of us have, is something called confirmation bias. We look for evidence to support things we believe. We very rarely look for evidence that might contradict our beliefs.